There's a founder I worked with, but I'm not going to name him, but you'll recognize him immediately because half the people listening to this are kind of like him, who had a genuinely excellent business, good revenue, smart team, real traction. He had done the hard work of building something from nothing, and the thing was working. But every single week, the same problems came back to him. Client complaint, back to him. Team conflict, back to him. Pricing decision, back to him. Should we stay late to finish this? Back to him. His calendar was a graveyard of decisions that should never have reached his desk. And here's what was interesting. He wasn't a control freak. His team wasn't incompetent. He had actually built good processes. He had an organizational chart, he had job descriptions, he had spent real money on operations. But when I sat across from him and asked the one question that matters, if you left for 2 weeks and your team had to decide what excellent looks like without you, what would they say? And he went quiet for a very long time. And then he said, I don't know. I've never written that down. That's a problem I see everywhere, right? Not a lack of strategy, not a lack of tools, not a lack of effort, the absence of a standard. Welcome back to Not Yet Mature. I'm Deon. Today we're talking about something that I think is the single most underestimated lever in building a sustainable company. And it has nothing to do with AI and nothing to do with your next funding round and nothing to do with the framework you read about last week. Everything to do with who you are, what you actually believe is worth doing excellently, and whether the people around you can hold that standard when you're not in the room. So there's a pattern that I want to discuss. Let me tell you what I see in the conversations I have with founders right now. Founders who are serious, who are working hard, who are genuinely trying to build something that lasts. They are drowning in solutions and they're starving for standards. What do I mean by that? I mean that the default move when something isn't working is to reach for a new tool, a new framework, a new process, a new hire. And sometimes that's the right call. But most of the time, the real problem underneath isn't that you don't have the right system. It's that the people inside the system don't know what excellent looks like from the inside. There's no standard in the room. You see, a system tells people what to do. A standard tells people what good looks like when they do it. And these are not the same thing. You can have a system that says respond to client emails within 24 hours. That's a process. But a company standard says, in this company, we respond within 24 hours. And when we can't, we communicate before the window closes. And our communication is never rushed or defensive because our clients deserve to feel like they matter. And that's a different thing entirely. That's culture in writing. That's character codified. And the founder I described at the open, his problem wasn't that he hadn't built processes. His problem was that his team had learned over time that the safest thing to do was to wait for his judgment. Because the standard, what excellence actually looks like, lived only in his head, and everyone knew it. That is what I call a standards vacuum. A standards vacuum doesn't stay empty. It fills with the lowest shared assumption of everyone in the room, which is almost never high enough. Believe it or not, this is the leadership problem underneath most of the operational problems I personally encounter. Not a strategy problem, not a talent problem, a standards problem. And there's a couple of peer voices we need to consider. I'm not the only one seeing this. Let me bring in some of the voices I've been tracking this week because I think the convergence here is worth paying attention to. Simon Sinek dropped something quietly in his May content that I keep coming back to. He was talking about leadership and debate, specifically about why teams get stuck in the same arguments over and over, never resolving anything. And his diagnosis was precise. Most debates that go in circles aren't really about the options being debated. They're about the absence of shared standard. Now, those are the words of Simon Sinek. Circular debates aren't a communication problem. They're a standards problem. When everyone has a different internal definition of what good looks like, you can't agree on a solution because you're not measuring against the same thing. That maps directly onto what I see in founders as team. The fights about the website design that never end, the pricing debates that go around in circles, the hiring process that everyone has different opinions about. Most of those aren't argument problems, they're standard problems. Now let's talk about Alex Hormozy, because he and Tony Robbins had a conversation recently that had a massive impact because it was removed, right? It's been the most circulated long-form piece in founder circles this year by far. If you can find that video, I think Tony Robbins still has it up. It's brilliant. And I want to bring it in from a specific angle. Robbins looked at Hormozy, who is, by any measure, one of the most disciplined operators in the business education space right now. And he said, "You're too stuck up here." In his head, all the execution, all the discipline, living only in the cognitive channel. And the thing Robbins kept pressing was a shift from achievement to contribution, not as a feelings argument, but as an identity argument. When your standard is rooted in achievement, it collapses the moment the metrics go bad. When your standard is rooted in contribution, in what you're actually here to do for other people, it holds even when the numbers are ugly. I want to add something to that framing, and I'll get to it in a minute. But first, let me bring one of the greatest entrepreneurial mindsets currently is Chris Corner. I want to bring him into this argument because he argues from evidence in a way I found compelling. Corner has been posting stories about ordinary people who built real businesses without the conventional credentials. A guy who made $0 online until he sent one text message. 20 minutes later, $6,000 wired. 6 years later, $100,000 and $400,000 a month with almost no overhead. Another guy who makes six figures driving people across a bridge. They're too scared to drive themselves. $40 cash. 10 to 30 clients a day. Some of them have been paying him daily for years. What do these people have in common? They are not the most talented, to be honest. They are the most well connected. They found one real problem. They showed up consistently, and without necessarily calling it that, they built a standard. That standard became a business. The peer voices this week, Sinek, Hormozy, Robbins, Corner, are all orbiting the same truth in their own language. The external system is only as good as the internal standard. Now, what does the framework look like? So let me give you the framework I use when I work with founders on this journey. I call it the 3 layers of a standard, and I want you to notice that these get harder as you go deeper, not because the concepts are complex, but because each one requires something more personal from you. And the first layer number 1, is the standard in your work. This is the surface layer, the most visible, the most measurable. Every company does something. The question is, can you describe what excellent looks like in that thing? Specifically enough that someone who had never met you could hold that standard. Not aspirationally, specifically. Not, we do great work. What does great work look like in practice? What does it sound like in a client call? What does it feel like when someone opens the deliverable? What would you reject and on what grounds? Most founders can tell you their values. Very few can describe their standard of work in enough detail that someone else could apply it without them in the room. And this is the first layer to establish. It's hard enough, but it's mostly cognitive. You can figure it out with a notepad and 2 hours of honest thinking. The second layer, layer number 2, is the standard in your team. This is where it gets more textured. The standard in your team isn't about rules or SOPs, though those have their place. It's about this shared definition of what doing this work will actually mean here. It's the unwritten answer to the question, what does it mean to be excellent on this team? And here's the thing most founders don't want to hear. The standard doesn't come from a training document. It comes from what you model and what you tolerate. Remember, culture is what you tolerate and allow. Those 2 things over time define the ceiling of your team standards. What you model, how you show up to meetings, how you handle difficult client conversation, how you communicate under pressure, how you respond to a mistake, sets the actual bar regardless of what's written in the handbook. What you tolerate, the quality of work that you accept without comment, the behavior you allow to slide, the standards you enforce inconsistently, that sets the floor. Truth be told, the distance between your model standard and your tolerated standard is the exact size of your culture problem. And most culture problems aren't values problems. They tolerance problems. And I want to get to the third layer number 3, the standard in yourself. This is the deepest layer. And this is where I'm going to part ways little with the peer voices. Robbins is right that contribution outlasts achievement as a motivational foundation. I believe that, but I think the sourcing matters. Robbins roots contribution in the emotional reward of serving others, the fulfillment you feel when you live beyond yourself, and that's real. But Deon's frame, my frame, is slightly different, and it runs deeper for me. I build well because I've been entrusted with something, not because it makes me feel good, because there's a standard of stewardship that I answer to that isn't about my emotional state on any given Tuesday. And that's a different engine, and it runs longer. I want to get biblical here. Proverbs 22 verse 29 says, "Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings." Solomon isn't describing a strategy, it's describing a person whose internal standard of craft is so visible, so consistent, so deeply personal that it puts them in rooms they've never had to campaign to enter. The standard they've built in themselves speaks before they do. And here's the line I want you to carry with you from today's episode onwards. Character is the only standard that doesn't require enforcement. Systems get gamed. Metrics get hit on technicality. Rules get followed to the letter and violated in the spirit. But when the leader's character is the standard, visible, consistent, self-enforced, it sets the culture ceiling without a single policy document. You cannot automate who you are. You can automate what you do. You can systemize your workflows. You can delegate your tasks, but the standard that flows from your character, from what you genuinely believe is worth doing well, cannot be delegated or automated. It has to be embodied. And the sobering thing about that is this: your team is watching. They see the gap between what you say and what you do. They see what you tolerate in yourself and you don't tolerate in them. They see when the standard rises or falls based on whether you're having a good week. The standard in the room is always set by the person with the most influence. And in most young companies, that's you. I want to give you some questions now. I want you to actually sit with these, not process them quickly and move on. Some of these are going to be kind of like uncomfortable, but that's the point. Question 1. If you look inside the mirror, do the mirror effect and just reflect on this. If your team had to describe the standard of excellent work in your business, what would they say? Not your mission statement, not your values list, the actual standard of excellent work specifically. What does excellent look like when someone finishes a task here? What would you push back and why? If you can't answer that in 2 sentences, your team definitely will not be able to do it. The second question I want to ask yourself is, what decisions come back to you every week that should be made by someone else? Be honest, list them. Go for 5 or 10. Now ask, why do these keep coming back to me? If the answer is because my team doesn't have the information, that's a systems problem. Fix the information flow. But if the answer is because they're not sure what I would decide, that's a standards problem. The standard hasn't been defined clearly enough for someone else to hold it. Those 2 answers lead to completely different actions. Make sure you know which one you're dealing with. The third question is, what do you tolerate in yourself that you wouldn't tolerate in your team? And here's a side note. This is the most important question of them, and the one people most quickly explain away. Do you show up late to your own meetings? Tolerate rushed communications when you're tired? Deliver more or deliver work that's 80% when you could get it to 95%? Specifically, if you had more time. Make promises you don't keep. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to notice the gap between the standard you hold others to and the standard you hold yourself to. And it goes vice versa. Some people are too hard on themselves because your team has noticed. They've been watching. The gap between those 2 standards is a gap in your culture. The fourth question is, if you stepped away for 2 weeks, the typical, I think the standard is actually 30 days, but let's go for 2 weeks here. What would happen to the standard of work? Will it rise? Will it hold? Will it fall? If the honest answer is it will fall. That tells you where the standard currently lives. It lives in you, not in the culture, not in the team, not in the systems. You've built something that needs you, which is a form of success and a form of a ceiling, both at the same time. The fifth question I want you to ask is, what do you actually believe is worth doing excellently? And does your behavior confirm that belief? This is the stewardship question, not what you aspire to value, what your actions confirm you value, because over time, your behavior is more honest than your beliefs. What you spend time on, what you invest in, what you refuse to cut corners on when no one's watching, that is your actual standard, not the one on the wall, the one inside the work. And here's your challenge. Here's your one action before Friday. I'm not asking you to overhaul your culture. I'm not asking you to write standards document for your entire business. I'm asking you to do one thing this week. Define your standard. Write it down. Tell someone, not a goal, not a policy, a standard, a specific description of what excellent looks like in one area of your work. Specific enough that someone else could hold it without you explaining it to them in the moment. It might be the standard for a client communication, the standard for how your team runs its Monday meetings, the standard for what a finished deliverable looks like before it goes out the door, the standard for how you personally show up to a difficult conversation. One thing written, shared with at least one other person. And then this is a part that matters. Live it yourself first before you ask anyone else to hold it, because here's what I've watched happen over and over. When a founder does this seriously, the people around them relax. Not because expectations dropped, but because uncertainty went away. People thrive when they know what excellent looks like. They perform at the level of the standard that's been set. When that standard is clear and consistent, the standard in the room doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be present. Let me land on cynic one more time before I close. Most debates that go in circles aren't really about the options being debated. They're about the absence of a shared standard. If your company has circular debates, decisions that keep coming back, conflicts that never fully resolve, quality that fluctuates in ways you can't quite diagnose, I want to gently suggest that before you reach for a new tool or a new framework or a new hire, you ask the prior question. What is the standard here? And is it clear enough that everyone knows it without you being in the room? You can't automate who you are. You can't systemize your way to character, but you can build one written standard at a time. The kind of environment where excellent is the expectation and not the exception. Set the standard before Friday. Write it. Live it first. Bless you guys. Thank you for joining in.